Shavua Tov, as we approach Rosh Hashanah, perhaps the best way to prepare is to sprinkle upon ourselves the ashes of the red heifer. What? We don't have the ashes of the red heifer. True. However, there is a spiritual process that was part of that ancient ceremony, which we would do well to understand and incorporate in our own spiritual preparations for the upcoming days of awe. With that as an introduction, let's dig into a very simple but surprising mitzvah in this week's parsha. It is the simple mitzvah of sending away the mother bird before taking the eggs or the chicks. Not to take the mother bird together with the eggs or the chicks, rather to shoo her away. Okay, that's a very nice, humane commandment. It seems to be clearly an expression of God's mercy, I would say so. And the Torah promises a very great reward for this very simple commandment. V'ha'arachta yamim, you will live a long life. The rabbis in the Mishnah say that we do not really understand the idea of reward for mitzvot at all. And they explain why. Because we have another mitzvah that also promises long life. Which one is that? Honor thy father and thy mother. And that, say the rabbis, is the hardest mitzvah to fulfill. It's a lifelong commitment. Whereas the reward for it is the same lengthened days. And this commandment is perhaps the simplest. It takes only about a second and a half to go shoo, shoo, shoo. Goodbye, the bird is gone. Now you can take the eggs and the chicks. Simple, and that also brings a long life. So the hardest and the easiest have the same reward. Rather, we don't understand the impact of reward for commandments. Okay, but let's take a deeper look into what exactly are commandments. Now, this commandment of sending away the mother bird seems to clearly indicate God's mercy. So it is surprising that there is a fellow who we are supposed to tell him, shut thee up. To whom do I refer? The Gemara says in Brachot that a cantor who gets up in front of the congregation and starts to compose his own prayers and says, O God, your mercy extends to the nest of the mother bird. We say to him, shh, stop, don't say that, you can't say that. And the question is why? Isn't it true? It seems to be quite a merciful commandment. So what is wrong with saying it as a prayer? Well, there are a number of explanations. There are a lot of commentaries on this. I'd like to suggest two. The first one is the practical one, and that is, what is the idea behind the reasons for commandments? Is the reason the foundation for the commandment, which if it were to be removed, the commandment would no longer be in force? Or is there something else going on? We have the commandment, for example, of the red heifer, which I mentioned previously. The red heifer is described as a chok. A chok is a divinely decreed commandment which no amount of logic can shake. We observe it because God commanded it, whether we understand it or not. And it is the quintessential, difficult to understand commandment, but we will go into that a little further. So every commandment, even if we think we understand it, we still observe it because God commanded it. And that's very important, because if we would assume that we're going to observe the commandments because we understand the reason for it, well, then the human creativity is very powerful. We could easily find a way to justify how that reason doesn't apply in my case, and I can go ahead and do what I want, as King Solomon, the wisest of humans, did with the prohibition for a king to have too many wives, too many horses. He said, it's the commandment, the Torah says, don't have too many wives so they don't turn your heart astray. Well, I'm a smart guy, said King Solomon. They won't turn my heart astray. And he marries 100,000 women. And guess what? They turned his heart astray. So we shouldn't think that we're smarter than God. And I guess by saying it in prayer, it is as if we are signing on the dotted line that is the reason, capital T, capital R, for this commandment. And that is not the case. The reason for the commandment is that God commanded it. And that's a very important perspective. For first of all, there are other explanations for this commandment that don't have to do with mercy. One of the nice ones I saw was that it actually has to do with concern for the environment, conservation of species. If you take the mother and the eggs and the chicks all together and kill them all, you're basically causing extinction to this particular family and perhaps to the entire species if it is done on a big enough scale. My family was blessed to be visiting the States this past summer, and we took them on a whale watch, and we saw 15 of these magnificent creatures, humpback whales, including a remarkable occurrence of 4 of them breaching out of the water at the same time, something that doesn't happen. It was so unique that it was on the news. You see these creatures, you make a blessing to God, and you realize that they were on the brink of extinction. And I think that some species of whales still may be. And we have a responsibility to preserve the species. We have a responsibility to be responsible custodians of the world, of nature. And so therefore there is that explanation given as well. So it's an example of another explanation. And therefore the cantor who says that it's because of divine mercy should not say that, because he's not the one to decide what's the real reason for the commandment. There are many reasons. And one could add that the idea of a reason in Hebrew is ta'am. Ta'am can also mean a taste. It's something that helps make the commandment meaningful to understand what it is about, but it is not why I keep the commandment. If, for example, I have a cold and I can't taste the food I'm eating, that doesn't mean I therefore stop eating. I'd starve. So of course we continue to eat, but if it's a nice tasting food, that makes it all the more pleasant, and so too it is with the commandments. We would keep the commandments even if there was zero understanding of what they're all about. But when we have an understanding, that makes us perform them with more gusto, just like we eat tasty food with more gusto. So that is one explanation, so that we do not mistakenly think that we know the reason for the commandment, but rather we have a humility, we observe the commandment whether we understand it or not, and we do try to understand it, and that adds to our motivation to keep the commandment with gusto. However, I'd like to suggest, based on the Ramban, a more revolutionary understanding. Let's take a trip back in history to the shores of the Reed Sea, Yam Suf. The Jewish people are being pursued by Egypt, and Moses is trying to calm their panic, and he says to them, Hashem yilachem lachem, God will fight on your behalf, ve'atem tacharishun. You can remain silent. Don't be panicked. Relax, God's going to fight the battle. But God wasn't pleased with this little speech of Moshe's. He immediately says to Moshe, Ma titzakei lai, what are you yelling to me for? Daber el b'nei Yisrael ve'yisau. Speak to the Israelites and let them go forward into the sea. Let them perform the miracle. Why are you putting it all on me? In other words, God is not the one being merciful to the mother bird. We are. God's commandment is not an expression of God's mercy to the birds or to whatever the reason of any mitzvah might be, but rather his desire or his commandment that we should evince that character trait. That's a very significant difference. And therefore, when a person prays to God and says, your mercy extends to the nest of the mother bird, that is false. That is what Moshe was doing to Bnei Yisrael. He was saying, God's going to do it for you. No, it's not God's mercy. It's we who have to have mercy. And this is an entirely new understanding of the idea of a commandment. That there are reasons for the commandments, but those reasons are not why God commanded them, but they're rather what God wants us to gain out of the performance of these commandments. It's very interesting. What exactly is God's perspective when he gives a commandment? So it's interesting. There's a Gemara, I believe, in Makot, that says that Moses gave us 613 commandments, and then it lists a number of other great people throughout history who diminished the number of commandments. Not that they erased them from the book, but I guess they summarized them or encapsulated them in less. David HaMelech, in one of the Mizmorim of Tehillim, brings it down to 11, and I think Yeshayahu HaNavi is mentioned over there. And finally we come to Chavakuk HaNavi, who consolidates the 613 commandments into one commandment. And what is the one commandment that Chavakuk says represents all of them? Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh. The righteous person in his faith will live. And that is why I think that when God gave the one commandment, as it were, it was a commandment to live. God wants us to live. Every commandment that God gives us is to live. And we express that in 613 different ways, by putting on tefillin, by saying Shema, by observing the holidays, by keeping kosher, by sending away the mother bird, and by honoring our parents, and by observing the Sabbath, and all of the other 613. Each one of those is an expression of the commandment to live. And why do I say that that's so important? Because the Torah starts with that. The first commandment that the human race is given is Peru Urevu. Be fruitful and multiply. That means to live and cause to live, to bring life into existence. The first prohibition, other than Adam and Eve not being allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge, is in, I think, the next week, Parshas Noach. Aches nafshech es dimchem nafshosechem edrosh. It's a prohibition. I will pursue. I will seek after the blood of your own selves. In other words, it's the prohibition against committing suicide. Because God wants us to live, not to die. And that is what Chavakuk is saying, that God's commandment is Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh, the righteous one in his faith will live. Every commandment is to live, and there are 613 expressions of that life that God wants us to fulfill. Very fascinating. And this brings us to the red heifer. Because the red heifer, the mystery of the red heifer, is not what it seems to be. The particulars of that commandment are actually quite explainable, and there are many explanations for them. Rashi, though, says that there's a mystery involved. What's the mystery? He doesn't say it's a mystery. He says there's an attack. There's an attack on this particular commandment on the part of the Satan and the nations of the world, that they attack Israel, and they say, what is the reason for mitzvah, for this particular mitzvah? So God says, it's my decree, you keep it anyway. What exactly are they complaining about? First of all, when have the nations of the world ever particularly gone after the mitzvah of the red heifer, which is done to purify somebody who became tamei mate, impure by contact with a dead body? The non-Jews may make fun of religious Jews not turning on and off lights on the Sabbath. They may make fun of some of the strange rituals that we perform. I'm sure that if you would take somebody into the synagogue on the morning of Sukkot and they'll see a bunch of grown men shaking leaves and branches every which way, they're going to say, I'm in a nut house here. But para aduma, I've never heard that the Satan and nations of the world are making fun of that one, are complaining about that one. And it's also an interesting teaming up of the Satan and the nations of the world. What is this all about? So we've discussed this a lot before, so I'm going to just get to the point. And that is, it's nothing to do with the particulars of the mitzvah of para aduma. It's got everything to do with why bother with the mitzvah of para aduma. Why bother to become pure? Para aduma, a red heifer. The word aduma comes from the same word as the name of Esav, which is Edom. Esav, who says to Yaakov this exact question when he comes back in from the field, and Yaakov is making a soup, and Yaakov makes a condition that he'll give Esav the soup if he sells him his birthright. And Esav responds, Hinei anochi holech lamut, I'm going to die. So of what use is this birthright to me? In other words, what Esav was saying is, life is meaningless. We're going to die. So the only reason to live is to enjoy life. This is a very dangerous idea, this idea that life is about enjoying it, because that could lead to any kind of terrible behavior on the one hand, and it could also lead to a person missing out on their special divine purpose on the other. The purpose of life is not to enjoy it. The purpose of life is to use the gifts that God gave us to fulfill His will and improve the world. The purpose of life is to live. There is life and there is death. And there are people. Life is not just about breathing and having a pulse. Evil people, say the rabbis, even when they're alive, they're considered dead because they do actions which bring death and not life, spiritual and maybe even physical. Whereas the righteous people, even after their bodies are gone, even after they are physically dead, they are considered alive because their teachings and their traditions continue to inspire people to life-giving activities. And those are the mitzvot. So God commands us, yes, you're going to physically die at some point, but you must live. And to live means you must be pure. You must have tahara. How do you achieve that? 613 different ways. King Solomon was puzzled by this idea of the red heifer, not by the particulars of the mitzvah, but by the whole question of what's the point. As he says, everything is vanity. And he explores this entire possibility that the purpose of life is to enjoy it. He explores in this book of Ecclesiastes, which is written about this question raised by the red heifer, by the mitzvah of the red heifer. He explores every possible enjoyment of life that a person could have, and he as king had access to things that everybody else could dream of. And yet he said it doesn't work. The only thing that works is sof davar, fear the Lord, keep his commandments, because this is the entirety of man. Man has 248 limbs and 365 sinews, or the other way around, whatever. We have a total of 613 body parts, allegorically speaking, of course, to parallel the 613 commandments. By keeping each commandment, we give ourselves life. That's what the commandments are about. And what aspect of life? Well, this is our job, to understand what each mitzvah means, and as we perform that mitzvah, to try to incorporate the meaning of that mitzvah into our life, to develop our character, to improve our behavior. We have 613 ways to do it, but each of them is an expression of tzaddik be'emunato yichyeh, of living. So therefore, as we approach the high holidays, the best thing we can do is to sprinkle upon ourselves the ashes of the red heifer in a spiritual sense, by observing the commandments and by paying more attention to the meaning of each commandment, and using that understanding to improve our character and to spiritually grow, so that we can reach great heights on these great days that are approaching us. Shavua Tov.